What is wrong with our teenagers is a common question we hear today among the adult population. What is wrong with the older generation can be heard from the other side. The history of the dislocation of young and old is a relatively modern one, exacerbated today by multi-billion dollar pound, yen, etc. industries that thrives in maintaining a gap that helps to destroy and undermine particularly one of the most important transitions in a young person's life, that of the transformation from adolescence to adulthood. Today, education, in inverted commas, has become a barrier in our young to develop the cooperative skills needed to meet the kind of problems we face in the world today. We still teach our young competitively by age group, by shoehorning into subject specialisation, by tailoring for jobs that don't exist, by brutalising homework and exams that tell us more about the threshold for boredom than they do for what pupils and students have to offer as creative individuals. What the commercial categorisation of relationships failed to destroy in this isolation process, the slack can be taken up by the mythology created by those political classes whose power is maintained by deepening the illusions that our teenagers live in a world all of their own making, rather than one created and controlled by business interests. There is another idea in the world we live in of being young, growing, developing, learning, adventure, play and finding a place in the world. One where the young are involved in the day-to-day events and part of the process of what's going on and are encouraged to develop out with the restrictions of schooling. We should be educating our young for the here and now and amongst their community, not just educating for some far-off job prospect which may not transpire. We need to learn with young people and from them and learn to stop using them as scapegoats for our own adult failings. Here I want to look at some of the mythology that surrounds youth, what they are blamed for, and the need for the adult generation to grow up and take on the responsibility we so quickly accuse our young people of lacking. We are all in it together, young and old, and we will not get very far unless we all learn to share and take the responsibility for the environmental global catastrophe we are heading towards. The young have the energy to take us where we want to go. It's up to all of us to nurture in them the historical context of the struggle and to help them find a path to a less destructive world. The decommodification of relationships to relationships of ideas would be a good place to start. And we also need to keep in mind it is not the young who own the multinational corporations that are ravishing the earth's resources and creating expensive junk and mind candy that keeps us inert in front of the television. Much has happened in the last year or so. We have had the London uprising, the birth of the Occupy movement, the Arab Spring, and all sorts of things happening around the globe. Much of this activity instigated by young people, and much of it needs to be remembered also the outcome of generations of organisation, struggle and movement building. It's timely. All this happened not long after Don, Jackie, Louis, Ike and myself returned from a visit to Detroit to visit the community farms and to speak to activists working in and around the growing movement. It would be interesting to think about our conversations had these events happened before our visit. Much attention is paid to grassroots development in Detroit, and what is considered crucial is that of engaging young people in the process. This is an integral part of the organisational core of what's happening. The engagement of their young is not only a struggle against the commodification of young people's relations to each other, lack of employment, the blight of the city, but racism and the very criminalisation of black culture. What makes the Detroit experience of youth important to ourselves is that we can see our future through the experience of black struggle. The other thing we can learn is from the rich experience of communities who have fought against all of the odds and created something special and unique. Racism is the hallmark of a highly indoctrinated and backward society. The disregard for what our youth have to offer is on par with this stupidity, and both are closely related if you think about it. One of the things that came up in the conversations was the Detroit uprisings of 1967. They are careful to describe these events as uprising, not riots. The roots of the uprisings can be traced to the economic and spatial polarisation of Detroit from the 1940s onward. In '67, young people were being frisked because they were black. The police were considered then an occupying army. Most of the population of the city was black, but run almost exclusively by whites. This is what Grace Lee Boggs, a writer and long-term activist, was saying on public television's Democracy Now! In 2011 about the uprising of '67. Two things were happening. One, young people were being stopped and frisked by the police. Another thing that was also happening was that automation had come to the plants and young people were feeling that they were being made expendable and that there was no longer any future for them. And so the rebellion was also a cry for help, for understanding by these young people that something very fundamentally was happening that required change. Speaking of the present, she says, and I think to understand the depth of the roots of what happened helps us to get beyond seeing it as a riot and helps us to see that there were issues raised there that we still face. We have the equivalent of martial law on a day-to-day 24/7 hour basis in our cities because we had not heard the cry for help by the young people in 1967. She goes on, speaking of Martin Luther King, and in response to that, King moved to Chicago in 1966 to listen to these young people, and he came to the conclusion at the end of his life that what we needed was to listen to them and understand that the age of just expanding economically and technologically had come to an end, or we need to bring it to an end and understand how it created and had destroyed community and denied participation to so many people. And so we were at a watershed in human history, and that's where we are today. And I think that's the context in which we have to look at what happened in 1967. And also adding, but changing the whole infrastructure, because the rebellions represented this cry from young people to be of use in some way, to have a society in which instead of being outsiders, they were part and parcel of belonging and creating and being of use. If we reflect on this for a minute, remembering we are talking about America in the 1960s, many of these words hold up a mirror to a lot of the things we are seeing in their own communities in the UK 40 years on. Detroit Summer, a yearly event specifically aimed at young people, has been running in Detroit since young people were noticed to be absent at community meetings when important issues were being discussed that would directly affect them. Detroit Summer is an attempt to engage young folk in the here and now using the creative mediums that they relate to best. The lesson is our young people need to be included and be a part of things. So many get bored and are parentally pacified with treats and entertainment when what they are actually pining for is involvement and self-worth and that they can help make a difference. So what of the UK? What have we learned from the voice of the 60s? What does life look like through the eyes of a 16-year-old in the Britain of today? One thing is for certain in terms of my own generation, for we were all 16 at some point. At that age in East End of Glasgow, I was loading up my motorbike and taking off into the horizon to find adventure. The possibilities were endless. There was a dream alive in my head and a hunger for discovery. This may have been fantasy, but the important thing is I believed, along with other dreams and ideas, that they could happen. Many of my mates didn't share this wanderlust and became satisfied with thinking about a job, girlfriend, own place to stay and so on. But it seemed no matter what your choices were, there was hope of achieving these things. This was the 60s, there was something in the air, as the song of the time goes. When I went down to London when I was 17, 18, I didn't feel inferior as a working class youth. I felt positively superior. It was part of the movement, the revolution. It was very uncool to come from a moneyed or well-off background in these days. This was the baby boomer generation of those who grew up during the period between 1946 and 64. There was revolution in the air, a freedom from the stuffy bonds of a few pints and a fish supper of a Friday night to a cultural explosion of discovery, when Afghanistan was a place of pilgrimage on the magic bus for the young to chill out among ancient culture and other things, not a place we sent our youth to bomb. This was the background of the baby boomer generation, the young Bransons, the promoters of the counterculture, freedom, the youth movement, the same youth who are today's older generation and who sometimes find it so difficult and perplexing to understand the youth of today. So what happened to my generation? What happened to the generation who fought to create a voice for the young? What happened to that voice is the question we should be asking if we adults want to understand the present generation of teenagers who are searching and fighting for the very same things that we were, and in many ways in a much tougher world. A world where business still carries out atrocities in the name of oil, slave labour and pollution, in the exercise of maximising one's economic advantage. What difference is there when young people recently applied this same logic in the streets of London under oppressed unemployment, no hope, and the sneering of bankers and their political betters who loot with impunity? We should worry if these revolts didn't happen, and we should worry even more why they do. Putting these events down to just a bunch of hooligans rioting, as our government and corporate press suggests, we could remind ourselves of the above words of Grace Lee Boggs. We have the equivalent of martial law on a day-to-day 24/7 basis in our cities because we had not heard the cry for help by young people in 1967. We still have much of the same problems hearing them in 2012. The adult world have become expert in distancing themselves from the responsibilities and problems of our young. We can refer to a section of our kids as feral and other contemporary catchwords that organises society's problems into handy bracketed groupings that can be used in polite company and to distance the chattering classes of any kind of involvement or responsibility. This attitude only intensifies the problem, and you can guarantee the chattering classes who can pontificate on the media about problems and solutions will be nowhere to be found when the problems explode in our face. It's going to take more than a few magazines, articles, a few government reports, art projects, government community indulgence posing the progress, a few millions scattered around the place and a few hidden millionaires to ameliorate the adult rip-off our young are suffering from. This will take engagement, real discussion, action and sacrifice, not only of our money, but importantly our time. Today's scapegoat generation, like their 60s counterparts, are starting to react to the rip-off. As young age has become another social factor to join the scapegoating staples of race, ethnicity and gender, and just like each of these, the smokescreen of denial covers the real social problems, those of the selling out of our young folk to the benefit of grown-ups, indulgence, political expediency and media mythology, all controlled of course by adult supervision. If we look at some of the myths that are used to scapegoat the young, drink and drugs, a favourite. It's not teenagers who own and run the proliferation of city centre pubs offering happy hours pricing and competition with who can get the most drunk quickest. It's not teenagers who hand out the licences to the cattle market drinking emporiums that are squeezed into every space that becomes available in town. And it's not teenagers who produce the cheap television programming of handheld camera and CCTV for effective drunkenness that can be moulded and shaped to fit the adult agenda. All of this can be carried out without exposing any responsibility of the adult world of government and business, aided by the corporate media who profits by a negative image of teenagers, the same teenagers who have little access to these mediums unless it is to perpetuate the adult perception of what teenagers represent. For so many of our young, hanging around the shopping centre till you're old enough for the pub is not a great option in encouraging the creativity of future generations. I am told when I comment on the surreal scenes in central Glasgow of mostly drunken youth and getting younger by the minute any evening of the week that you were probably the same when you were young. It may be the case for some, but from what I can remember I couldn't afford to get legless weekdays. Friday and Saturday at a push if your dole money or wages stretched. One thing I know, that whatever drinking or lifestyle choices are made then for entertainment were not determined by uptown corporate pub chains, multi-level sports bars selling alcohol that tastes like sweeties and using the tactics of the small-time drug dealer in happy hours you inevitably pay for later. I don't remember my drinking choices or lifestyle being informed by television and fly-the-wall documentaries of nightlife, binge drinking, no matter how cool or uncool it looks. The commercial abuse of teenagers by television is as morally repulsive as the sexual exploitation of women by advertising, and it is not teenagers who sit on the executive boards of public relations and television companies. Then there's the drugs.
There's something happening here. What it is ain't exactly clear. There's a man with a gun over there, telling me I got to beware. I think it's time we stop. Children, what's that sound? Everybody look what's going down. Battle lines being drawn, and nobody's right if everybody's wrong. Young people speaking their minds are getting so much resistance from behind. Every time we stop, hey, what's that sound? Everybody look what's going down. What a field day for the heat. 1,000 people in the street, singing songs and carrying signs, mostly say hooray for our side. It's time we stop. Hey, what's that sound? Everybody look what's going down. Paranoia strikes deep into your life, it will creep. It starts when you're always afraid. Step out of line, the man come and take you away. We better stop. Hey, what's that sound? Everybody look what's going on. We better stop. Hey, what's that sound? Everybody look what's going. We better stop now. What's that sound? Everybody look what's going. We better stop. Children, what's that sound?
The saturation of drugs in our communities, both legal and illegal, can be placed on the shoulders of those least able to defend themselves of the blame. For instance, attacking casual drug use by teens whilst ignoring rampant heroin abuse in older youth and adults. The circus created in the media when young folks started taking ecstasy, when little attention was being paid to heavy drug use, at a time when smack and heroin abuse was going through the roof, and death through the use of these hard drugs were sidestepped in pursuit of a drug that made you want to dance and drink water in a free venue of an abandoned building. Perhaps the media attention and real paranoia of E on the market was the idea of young people enjoying themselves without the intervention of the older generation profiteering through the alcohol industries they own and run. Maybe the rave scene was too reminiscent of a 60s backlash in entertainment unaided by business interests. If you look at the figures, we can understand the concern of those who profit from alcohol use and abuse. In 1998, the UK population spent £29,805 million on buying alcohol. The UK government revenue from alcohol was almost £11.5 billion in 1999-2000. In the UK, almost 2/3 of alcohol is bought and consumed in licensed premises. The number of alcohol-related deaths more than doubled from 4,144 in 1991 to 8,758 in 2006. The biggest increase was for men aged between 35 and 54, not teenagers. Where does dropping E, dancing and drinking water in disused factories compare with these statistics? Statistics that should have created then and now grave concern and blanket coverage in the business press. The answer we all know is simple: profits. It's permissible to waste your life through legal drugs like alcohol because the state and big business makes too much money from it. I'm sure that the rave scene had its share of criminals, but the thing that frightened business most, which set the corporate media alight, was not about drugs, but its independence. Teenagers were having fun out with the business world's profit machine. And to quote David Nutt, a former chairman of the UK Advisory Council on the Misuse of Drugs, stated in the Journal of Psychopharmacology in January 2009 that ecstasy use compared favourably with horse riding in terms of risk, with ecstasy leading to around 30 deaths a year in the UK compared to about 10 from horse riding. The general public, especially the young generation, are disillusioned with the lack of balanced political debate about drugs. This lack of rational debate can undermine the trust in government in relating to drug misuse, and thereby undermining the government's message in public information campaigns. The media in general seem to have an interest in scare stories about illicit drugs, though there are some exceptions. A telling review of 10-year media reporting on drug deaths in Scotland illustrates the distorted media perspective very well. During this decade, the likelihood of a newspaper reporting a death from paracetamol was 1 in 250 deaths. For diazepam it was 1 in 50, whereas for amphetamine it was 1 in 3, and for ecstasy every associated death was reported. The scapegoat of youth and drug culture is part of the denial of a rational debate in drugs by those who find it expedient to maintain the status quo. Only by putting pressure on government and forcing that debate will we ever be able to expose and create the understanding of the real impact of drug-related issues in our society as a whole, the society our children will inherit. I am not advocating the use of drugs in any shape or form, but can the adult world claim any credence in preaching to our teens about drug abuse when the most detrimental drug of all in our communities, alcohol, almost completely sits outside the drug conversation? And the fact teenagers don't drink most of it, don't profit off it, don't commit most of the crime under the influence of it, and are not the most vulnerable group to die from it. It's adults. By far the worst exploitation of teenagers by adults is the debt they are accruing. We accuse our young of having it too easy. But what exactly is it they have too easy? Is it the cheap rented accommodation of social housing that their parents have sold off to further their personal nest with? A tripling of housing costs in under a decade, and the largest generational asset transfer from young and poor to old and rich in UK history? Is it the blowing of their children's inheritance in luxury goods and expensive lifestyles? Is it free education that was afforded to all of their parents' generation that our young now pay through their nose for? It is the same generation who sold off the council houses, denying their kids the same opportunity as they had for cheap housing, and the same hippies who became millionaires by selling the lifestyles they themselves used to cherish as freedom when young, and are now used to increase profit margins in old age. We now blame 13-year-olds for their own poverty. Violence is a teenage problem. The teenager has a problem amenable to costly treatment, and who in the end will inherit the cost of the treatment through their parents' debt. We have moved away from promoting the well-being of children to the well-being of adults, and politicians are being remembered for articulating the adult rationale for ripping off the young. We enter the sphere of political hypocrisy when teenagers are adults when convenient for adults, and children when convenient for adults. There is no adult blame fest to match the many aimed at our teenagers. None propose to make adults live under adult supervision, as we push kids to the margins, then blame them for their lack of responsibility. We are somehow supposed to think that a subculture operating out with the sensibilities of grown-ups called teens is somehow natural. Teenagers are in another world detached from this one, i.e. the grown-up world. You know what they're like. Adults, it would appear, seem to know everything about teenagers, yet continue to ignore their needs. Teenagers do not live in a world of their own, they live in this one, not the imaginary world adults have created for them to keep them out of the way. The design of our built environment facilitates the alienation of young and old, and the car increasingly facilitates the insulation of adults from the real world. We become detached from each other, particularly from young people and teenagers. The grown-up world are as guilty as the teens that they accuse of being insular, introvert and single-minded. So where do we learn this? Some research suggests Parts in Society by Kenneth Warpole, the loss of relationship between home, street and neighbourhood. The findings of this research relating to public transport, the importance of the car and the lack of interest in local services or community interaction all suggest that residents' views are rooted in people's individual aspirations, which have little regard to society's broader priorities. This research also finds in housing complexes, most adult residents said they used a car for most or all of their journeys from home. Some admitted to never having walked out of the housing development. We wonder why our streets become the fantasy land of no-go areas and the territory of bored teenagers. The greatest single impact on children's freedom to play has been the rise of the car. Now 32 million of them in the UK, 4 cars for every child. Whilst our parks and play areas are converted to building sites and more car parking space, while the fitness culture driven by government initiative and business is based on how to get people indoors to costly centres of fitness excellence, mostly designed for the middle classes and professional use, while our parks and open spaces that have afforded a more natural resource of walking and playing are rendered dangerous, unused and surplus to requirements. Yet these are the places the older generation have enjoyed all of their lives. Research also states by 15, 2/3 of girls are classed inactive. The British Heart Foundation says 1/3 of under 7s fail to reach a minimum of recommended activity levels. And by the age of 15, 2/3 of girls are classified as inactive. 2/3 of 9 to 11-year-olds in the UK are dissatisfied with the quality of outdoor play facilities where they live. For 15, 16-year-olds, this rose to 81%, higher than any other European country. Living and communicating with our youth is not a lifestyle choice but a responsibility. Some of us who remember the mistakes of the 60s, and not only in Detroit, one being that those over the age of 30 were politically and socially meaningless and out with the revolution. It is that same generation who look down on teenagers now and how the ASBOs mark up the community dispersal zones, claim they can't understand today's teenagers and fail miserably or intentionally to understand the shared angst of all teenagers of all generations as they struggle to understand the confusing world of adulthood. Ken Warpole's research reminds us of the importance of creating child-friendly cities, and that in recent decades debate about public space has focused on women, loft dwellers, people with disabilities. Children's voices were silenced. We do not have a teenage section or a workers section for that matter in our mainline press. We do have a business section and a comprehensive sports section. I'm old enough to remember when we had a few newspapers that did in some way represent working class people. I even remember when broadsheets were broad enough to include some left analysis and workers' voices. But for teenagers, there is little that directs them into adulthood that is not tainted by educating the built-in disparities of the adult world, disparities of wealth, opportunity, expression and worthiness, that if perpetuated can only lead in our young to anger and violence. We need to start having the conversations of why our kids are murdering each other, committing suicide, which is still one of the leading causes of death among young people. There were 1,722 adolescent juvenile deaths by suicide in the UK between 1997 and 2003. Almost all were young people aged between 15 and 19. As adults, if this is the legacy of hope we leave for our young, where do our kids start to build a decent society for their own kids?